Done. Okay.
Sounds good. Leave it as it is.
Sounds good, right. So that's all. So আমরা basically we are about to start. Our question join করছে. So we thought like the best practices on AWS should be much better to start. আর এখানে সবাই যারা আছেন most of them already working in AWS, কারো workload already আছে, কেউ already run the AWS for almost 2 years and everything. So good to see you all. Amra definitely we will have an exciting sessions. So I was talking last অনেকদিন ধরেই হচ্ছে তারিকের সাথে and then we found him for that. So Tariq, hand over to you right now, and আপনি just একটা introduction আপনার একটা দিয়ে you can just take over the sessions, right?
Okay, thank you. Hello everyone, আমার নাম Tariq Habib. So আমি AWS এর সাথে AWS mainly I'm a solutions architect over there. So solutions architect হিসেবে আমাদের main কাজ বা আমার main job day to day যেটা থাকে সেটা হচ্ছে to work with the customer and then based on তাদের যে প্রয়োজন বা need অনুযায়ী proper actual solutionটা তৈরি করে দেওয়া, বের করে দেওয়া, because in general AWS in total প্রায় 175 plus services আছে, and within এতগুলো সার্ভিসের ভিতরে not necessarily that আপনাকে সবগুলোই জানতে হবে. So প্রয়োজন অনুযায়ী কোনটা বেশি প্রয়োজন সেটা নিয়ে মেইনলি কাজ করার জন্য সেটা অপটিমাম যে সলিউশনটা সেটা বের করাটাই হচ্ছে সলিউশন আর্কিটেক্টের কাজ থাকে. তো আমি একাডেমিক্যালি অ্যাকচুয়ালি ইলেকট্রিক্যাল ইঞ্জিনিয়ারিং আমার ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড. তো আমি এর আগে নাসার কিছু প্রজেক্টে ছিলাম কয়েক বছর, এন্ড দেন তারপরে সেখান থেকে বোয়িং এ ছিলাম সফটওয়্যার ইঞ্জিনিয়ার হিসেবে বোথ প্লেসেস কয়েক বছর, এন্ড দেন তারপরে তো গত এক বছর ধরে আমি আর কি AWS সলিউশনস আর্কিটেক্ট হিসেবে আছি. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. So প্রথমে আমরা actually we were struggling to figure out like what would be a good place to start a AWS নিয়ে. তো figured like best practices would be something a good starting point যেটা নিয়ে আমরা সবাই কথা বলতে পারবো এবং something relatable because but moving forward actually আমাদের এখানে হোস্ট প্রায় 13 জনের ভিতরে I would love to know যে আপনাদের AWS নিয়ে এক্সপেরিয়েন্সটা কি রকম, how like usually কোন ধরনের সার্ভিসটা আপনারা কাজ করেন বা যে সার্ভিসগুলো নিয়ে করেন সেটাতে অ্যাক্সেস লেভেল কতটুকু. I'd love to know that. That would be very helpful moving forward আমরা যেগুলো নিয়ে কথা বলবো আর কি.
আচ্ছা, আমি আমারটা একটু শুরু করি. আমি বেসিক্যালি অলমোস্ট 4 ইয়ার্স অফ AWS নিয়ে কাজ করছি. ইনিশিয়ালি আমি কাজ করতাম আপনার বেসিক্যালি সার্ভান্ট গুলো নিয়ে, EC2 নিয়ে, S3 বাকেটস, মানে মোটামুটি আর্কিটেক্ট লেভেলের কাজ করা হতো আর কি. তো রিসেন্টলি কিছুদিন ধরে আমি বেশি কাজ করছি আপনার সার্ভারলেস সার্ভিস গুলো নিয়ে, যেমন আপনার ল্যামডা আছে, API গেটওয়ে আছে, DynamoDB, রিসেন্টলি একটা অ্যাড হয়েছে অ্যাম্পলিফাই. তো এগুলো নিয়ে আমি একটু এক্সপিরিয়েন্স চালাচ্ছি যে অন্যান্য যেসব সফটওয়্যার কোম্পানিগুলো আছে তারা এগুলো কিভাবে ইউজ করছে, তাদের ব্লগগুলো পড়ছি আর কি, বা বিভিন্ন AWS এর বেশ ভালো ভালো ব্লগ থাকে তো সেগুলা পড়ছি আর কি. তো মোটামুটি সার্ভারলেস নিয়ে একটু স্টাডি করছি, যাতে কারণ বিকজ আমার মনে হয় সার্ভারলেস ইট হ্যাজ হিউজ মার্কেট ইন ফিউচার. সো that's all about myself. এবং তারিক ভাইয়ের কাছ থেকে জানবো যে যদি আরো কিছু বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস যেগুলো সার্ভারলেসের জন্য হতে পারে বা সলিউশন আর্কিটেক্টের ক্ষেত্রে বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস গুলো কি, এগুলো আমরা সবকিছু অলরেডি ব্লগে পাওয়া যায়, তারপরেও বাইরে যদি আরো কিছু জানতে পারি তো সেটার জন্য আসলে জয়েন করে এখানে. ঠিক আছে, সেটা
cool, thank you. আর কেউ? Okay, that's fine. Well, if there is any question or কেউ যদি শেয়ার করতে চান, by all means please do that. So I guess a little bit of an agenda আমরা আর কি এটা নিয়ে আজকে যেটা কথা বলবো, কিছু বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস অন আ হাই লেভেল কিছু ব্যাপার নিয়ে, প্লাস আজকে অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমরা যখন কথা বলছিলাম বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস, ডিফারেন্ট সার্ভিসের বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস কিছুটা ভ্যারি করে বেসড অন হাউ দ্য সার্ভিস ওয়ার্কস. সো একটা ভালো এক্সাম্পল ভাই মাত্র যেটা বললেন যে EC2 ভার্সেস ল্যামডা. সো দ্য ডিফারেন্স হচ্ছে যে ল্যামডা ইজ সার্ভারলেস, মিনিং দ্যাট EC2 তে আপনার যত ধরনের ম্যানেজিং কিছু হলো দরকার থাকে সেগুলো অল অফ দোজ আর ম্যানেজ ফর ইউ ল্যামডাতে. সো ল্যাম্বডা ইউজ করার সুবিধা হচ্ছে যেটা যে ইউ আর অনলি ফোকাসড জাস্ট অন ইউর কোড। আপনি কোড করবেন, you implement the code, and then everything on the back end it's taken care for you. So সেটার বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস ভার্সেস EC2 একটু ডিফারেন্স থাকবে। তো আজকে আমাদের অ্যাকচুয়ালি মেইন ফোকাস দুইটাতে মেইন থাকবে আসলে, সেটা হচ্ছে একটা হলো EC2 আর একটা S3, বাট আই উইল টক ইন জেনারেল অ্যাবাউট স্টোরেজ আর কম্পিউট রিলেটেড কি কি ধরনের বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস থাকতে পারে। তো ইন জেনারেল, বাট দ্যাট বিং সেড, cloud architecture, there are a couple of main practices যেটা বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস হিসেবে থাকা উচিত। তার মধ্যে যেরকম ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট হচ্ছে আপনার you design for failure. আপনি when you are architecting anything on cloud, you want to make sure that if আপনার যদি অ্যাপ্লিকেশন কোনো কারণে ফেল করে, you want to make sure যে আপনার অ্যাপ্লিকেশন সেটা হ্যান্ডেল করতে পারবে। You want to make that fault tolerant. From a security perspective, it's always the best idea not to have the security in just one place. So AWS, there is an array of different kinds of security tools. Jeta diye, it's always best idea to have basically security on every single level. Sheta apnar database hook, sheta apnar serverless hook, apnar regular access level hook, user level hook, on a bucket level. Amra ogulo niye aro details e bolbo ekটু পরেই। তো সেটা একটা। স্টোরেজ নিয়ে যেহেতু বলতেছিলাম, বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস হিসেবে একটা যেটা হচ্ছে যে there are different kinds of storage option. It's not just S3. আপনার object level storage হচ্ছে S3 plus আপনার block storage আছে, অন্যান্য caching এর জন্য special storage আছে. So it's not a one solution. So knowing when to use that, কিছুটা কথা বলবো। তো ফার্স্ট যেটা নিয়ে, so moving on, so the first যেটা বলতেছিলাম সেটা হচ্ছে যে designing your entire infrastructure for failure. So mainly what we want to make sure এখানে যে আমরা যখন infrastructure design করছি, we don't want everything সোজা এখানে যেটা বলছে যে not everything, all eggs in one basket, meaning that আমরা it's not a very good practice to have of course EC2 servers can handle basically any kind of workload, but it's not a good idea to have everything, meaning that in application layer, web layer, and then a database layer all in one place. So one of the examples আমি এখানে যে ফিগারটা আছে সেটা হচ্ছে যে আপনার ইউজাররা DNS থেকে অ্যাক্সেস করছে, অ্যাক্সেস করার পরে their IP অ্যাড্রেস থেকে অ্যাক্সেস করছে, বাট এখানে প্রবলেম যেটা হচ্ছে যে এখানে EC2 সার্ভার অনলি একটা, এবং এই উদাহরণটাতে যেটা আছে যে এই একটা EC2 সার্ভারে ইউ আর হোস্টিং এভরিথিং। It's okay if you want to try something by yourself, খুবই very small level, you're doing something as a hobby, it's a perfect idea, sure, go for it. But on a production level, যদি আপনার application চালাতে চান, it's not a good idea to have everything in EC2 server, just one or two EC2 servers. So that's one of the idea, that you don't want all eggs in one basket. And the second idea হচ্ছে যে having redundancy. So in general IT world একটা কথা আছে সেটা হচ্ছে যে everything fails all the time, and it's true. আপনার on premise কাজ করতে গেলে বা একটা sysadmin knows how much things breaks down on a daily basis. Same actually goes for in a cloud as well, because cloud is nothing special. It's the same thing. Things breaks all the time. So we need to make sure that when it breaks, it doesn't break the application. So we need to have a proper failover, meaning that one side breaks down, per application একটা side থেকে আরেক side failover করতে পারবে, and for that what you need is a redundancy. So talking about the first idea, সেটা হচ্ছে যে not having everything in all in one basket. So a little bit better from the previous আমরা যে ফিগারটা দেখছিলাম সেটা থেকে আমরা যেটা করলাম এখানে যে we are breaking down. So web/application server আর থেকে database serverটা বের করে নিয়ে আসলাম. So in this আমরা বলছি এখানে যে okay, we can use RDS to manage some of the stuff instead of not having everything in database, having everything in EC2 server. So that's a step in that you're breaking things down, and you're basically separating the workloads. And then the second যে উদাহরণটা বলছিলাম যে having redundancy. So this is compared to this one, this is a much better idea, যেটা হচ্ছে যে we're addressing the lack of addressing the failover, and we're addressing the redundancy. ইনফ্রাস্ট্রাকচারটাতে। So what that idea is, by the way, এখানে কি মোটামুটি সবাই availability zone region AWS এর এটা নিয়ে কি familiar?
মোটামুটি আইডিয়া আছে।
Okay.
হ্যাঁ, আমরা এগুলো
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so in that case, compared to the previous figure, আমরা যেটা বলছিলাম যে, so when the traffic is coming in, so at first আমরা দেখছি এখানে একটা elastic load balancer আছে. So elastic load balancer is balancing the traffic, and then not only that, it's actually getting, well, we have a master database, we have a standby database, and the traffic is separated. So what it's allowing to do is, for any reason, if one of the entire AZ is going down, our application is not breaking down. It's failing over to something else. And that is the idea, that if whatever happens, I don't know, like one of the AZ, natural calamity, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will shut off your entire application. And that's the idea. So in general, with that in mind, sort of summarizing, having a single point of failure, avoiding that. So whenever possible, you want to eliminate any kind of single point of failure. And what I mean by single point of failure is that আপনার application just being more careful এই ব্যাপারটা নিয়ে যে there shouldn't be any point যে if that particular part breaks down, it basically halts your entire application. So avoiding that. So same thing, using multiple availability zones, elastic load balancer use kora. We will talk more about the monitoring of the CloudWatch and having standby databases. I'm at a separate slide at pore. So, and yeah, in general, that's the idea. Any questions from here so far?
Yes, I have. Actually, আমাদের অ্যাপ্লিকেশনটা EC2 এবং RDS এর উপর ডিপেন্ড করে বা লোড ব্যালেন্সার ইউজ করা হয়, বাট অ্যাজ এ নিউজ পোর্টাল আমরা অনেক সময় 90 ডিগ্রি অ্যাঙ্গেলের স্পাইক হ্যান্ডেল করি। সেক্ষেত্রে EC2 ওয়ার্ম আপে অনেক টাইম লেগে যায়। সেই ক্ষেত্রে দেখা যায় আমার ইউজাররা 502 বা 504 ফেস করে। তো এটার কি আর কোনো অল্টারনেটিভ সলিউশন আছে?
So আপনারা কি কোনো ধরনের অটো স্কেলিং ইউজ করছেন?
হ্যাঁ, অটো স্কেলিং ইউজ করছি, বাট অটো স্কেলিং তো নতুন একটা সার্ভার অ্যাড হতেও তো একটা মিনিমাম সেকেন্ড বা মিনিমাম টাইম লাগে। সেই ক্ষেত্রে দেখা যাচ্ছে আমার ট্রাফিক একদম 90 ডিগ্রি অ্যাঙ্গেলে ইয়া করছে।
ওকে, সো
হ্যান্ডেল করার জন্য অল্টারনেটিভ কোনো ইয়ে আছে?
তো আপনার মিনিমাম সার্ভার কতগুলো চলছে ইন জেনারেল, লাইক উইদাউট এনি স্পাইক?
আমার চারটা সার্ভার তো চলছে EC2 C4X large.
Okay. There are several ways to do that. আপনার ধরেন যে what you can do is, and we can talk more about that offline, but there are a couple of ideas would be that আপনার যদি যেহেতু incoming থেকে তো আপনার matrix, we can look into some more robust matrix such as যদি মানে custom matrix যদি আপনি দেখতে পারেন, সেটা থেকে like triggering the auto scaling, that's one option, using caching. One other would be that আপনাদের যদি কোনো ধরনের anticipation থাকে যে general একটা পার্টিকুলার টাইমে আপনারা এক্সট্রা যে ট্রাফিকটা দেখছেন, সেটাতে সেরকম যদি কোনো সিচুয়েশন থাকে, আপনারা support ticket submit করতে পারেন. They will do is starting some of the new servers in ahead of time. So that could be one of the options. But what we can do is actually, yeah, we can talk about like we can look into what are some of the other matrices you can look into it, because one of the options actually definitely could be সেটা হচ্ছে যে আপনার যদি চারটা সার্ভার চলছে, বাট সেটা যদি টোটাল অ্যামাউন্ট অফ CPU ইউটিলাইজেশন যদি খুব হাই হয়ে যায়, তো এটা একটা চেষ্টা করে দেখতে পারেন যে আপনার ট্রিগারটা আরেকটু নিচে নামিয়ে দেয়।
নরমালি আমাদের CPU ইউটিলাইজেশন তো 30% এর নিচেই থাকে। 30% এর নিচে থাকে, বাট সাপোজ একটা নিউজ আসলো যেটা একদম খুব কুইকলি ট্রাফিককে নিয়ে আসছে বা ট্রাফিক হাই হয়ে যাচ্ছে, বাট মানে নতুন সার্ভারটা ওয়ার্ম আপ হতে কিন্তু মিনিমাম 1 মিনিট সময় লাগে, সেই সময় দেখা যাচ্ছে যে আমার ট্রাফিক গুলো হ্যান্ডেল হচ্ছে না।
আচ্ছা
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 তো আপনার
হাসিব বা তারিক, আমরা কন্টিনিউ করি। হ্যাঁ, let's we have a মানে কোশ্চেন অ্যান্সার সেশন আফটার 10 মিনিটস, মানে ওই শুরু শেষ করার লাস্ট 10 মিনিটস আমরা নিতে পারি, সো দ্যাট আমার মনে হয় বেটার, হাসিব যদি আপনি অ্যালাউ করেন।
শিওর
হ্যাঁ,
শিওর শিওর শিওর
তো তারিক মানে আপনি কন্টিনিউ করেন, সো উই উইল টেক দিস কোয়েশ্চেন লেটার অন, রাইট?
ওকে, sounds good. Alright, ঠিক আছে। So moving on, যেটা বলছিলাম যে some of the best practices EC2 তে maybe very important couple of them. First and foremost, security and network management. What would be some of the best ways to do that? So managing from AWS perspective, through either through console or through API. আপনার যারা access করছে সেটা control করা। So what I mean by that is having like IAM user, IAM role দিয়ে আপনার কে ইউজ করছে এবং তার কতটুকু ওভারঅল কন্ট্রোল আছে EC2 উপরে, এটা ম্যানেজ করা। Meaning that এবং it would be a very good practice, সেটা হচ্ছে not only to have an IAM user permission policy maintain করা, it's also a very good practice to implement roles. So what I mean by roles is আপনার ধরেন not everyone needs to have full access to whatever server they're using all the time. So কারো ধরেন একটা sysadmin, if they need to use a particular server for a particular amount of time to do some work, making sure that they can assume a role and do the work and then be done with it, that they don't have the access anymore. So এই ধরনের gate implement, that's always a better idea. Basically practicing a least privilege rule, meaning that যতটুকু প্রয়োজন তার থেকে বেশি অ্যাক্সেস যেন কারো না থাকে। And in general AWS আপনি যে কোনো সার্ভিস অন করেন, যে কোনো ধরনের সার্ভিস ইউজ করতে যান, that's that nothing is open, you need to open something explicitly to and give access to a user explicitly to do anything. Even that's the case for EC2. When you're spinning up a new EC2 instance, nothing is open. You need to open. So same goes for using that. When you're creating a security group for your IAM users, practicing this the least privilege rule, that's always very important. For multi-factor, this is the must when you are trying to have an information from a sysadmin perspective, meaning that multiple access means you need to have your regular password and then also something with your phone or an email, and then that sends a code every time. So it's a code that's constantly changing every time someone needs to log in. That also from an IAM perspective, there are several other options. For example, password rotation, so making sure that you implement that as well. Not only password rotation, also key rotation. So আপনার জানেন যে যখন EC2 instance SSH করে অ্যাক্সেস করতে হয়, সেটার জন্য key pair থাকে. So for that key pair, you can rotate that key, making sure it doesn't break. So having that. This rotation really helps to, first of all, to keep people on toes, because no one wants to, and it's very common for people to just write down and not having a proper password and then forgetting it. That kind of practices takes that out. On that note, one of actually the option is also is when you're setting up the password, there are certain limitations that you can put in. That, for example, it needs to be a certain amount of character, a character, and then also it should be a mix of capitals, letters, small letters, special characters, numbers, and all that, making sure that the password is a very strong password as well. Also, in general, it's always a very important. That's not just applicable to EC2 instance; it's also applicable to any AWS account. Is that you do not use your root account to do any kind of regular day-to-day work. So root account, you use it. After that, you basically sort of throw it out. don't use it ever. You don't make any key pairs with it. You don't do anything. You create users to do any kind of work. Because the problem is, if your root account is compromised, your entire business is compromised at that point. So never use root account to do any kind of work in AWS in general at all. Moving forward, so we are talking about storage. So as I was saying, and we will talk about this point, আমার step একটা section আছে যেটা নিয়ে কথা বলবো. But knowing that the implication of having root device, what kind of data are you using? What kind of data is getting used by your application? Does it all needs to be in block storage or any other ways? Which of those data needs to be persistent, or কতটুকু backup প্রয়োজন, কতটুকু recovery করতে পারবো? What are some of those data that can be recreated so that it doesn't need to be backed up all the time? That kind of idea. And then, yeah, in general, EBS versus S3. So EBS is elastic block storage, and then S3 is the object level storage that I was talking about. We'll talk about that in details in the coming slides. Moving on, so very important one is resource management. So this is important from a perspective of a sysadmin and as well as cost management because you want to know whether any kind of cloud you are, possibilities are endless, and then the options are endless. So you want to make sure that the resources you're using it in a proper manner and it is getting managed in a proper manner. What I mean by that is, so one of them will be from a security perspective, using IAM or to maintain that you don't want যে আপনার কোনো employee but anyone who has access to your account to start Bitcoin mining EC2 instances, because it can do that. We have EC2 instance with like 48 cores and 192 gigabytes of RAM or something like that. So you don't want anyone to spin something like that up. You want to have that resource management. It's very important. So some of the things that it does is, and having services like CloudWatch and CloudTrail, যেগুলো আপনাকে, when once again I have a separate slides for those to make sure that you get proper notification when someone's spinning anything up. So you monitor that and you respond to that. That can be manual, but then again, anything you can eliminate manual. You can automate some of those processes as well. So we'll talk about that in details, but you can automate a lot of that monitoring process. So doing that, and then reacting to that accordingly. And you want to set limits to your EC2 instance. Also knowing your EC2 instance limits, because every region, আপনার per account, there is a limit of how many instances of one type of you can spin up. The limit is pretty high, but in general, if your application demands it, it's not a problem. What you all need to do is just create a support ticket, and support ticket delay limit increases support ticket delay, they will increase it for you. Got to it. It's just you just need to make sure that if you are reaching that limit, and then communicating that with AWS support. So having that. And then finally, there are a couple other things like such as the backup and recovery. So EBS snapshots. So EBS is the block storage that you will attach to an EC2 instance. And that is something you can take a snapshot of, which is basically it's a snapshot in general. So if you need to AMI, so what an AMI is, it stands for an Amazon Machine Image. So whenever you're spinning up any kind of EC2 instance, so it's a bundle. You're using an AMI. So what it is, it's a bundle of everything. So your operating system, any of the batch updates, your applications, any of that installation is done. Also your permissions as well, because you can spin up an EC2 instance, but if it's using any of the other AWS services, which it will, and তখন এটার জন্য একটা exclusive permission দরকার, because you don't want your EC2 instance to have access to the entire AWS services. That wouldn't be safe. So you need to give it exclusive permissions to use whichever services you are planning to use. So this is something when you're creating an EC2 instance, you will specify যে এই IAM policy-তে these particular services it can use. And not only that, it's not just services it can use. You also go very granular, could be like more deep down of that in a particular service কোন action গুলা সে করতে পারবে. So a good example of that would be that if you have an application, all it's doing in S3 তে কোনো particular একটা file যেটা ধরলাম user upload করলো, all it can do is do a write on that file. So S3 সে যদি bucket access থাকে, so that EC2 instance that really doesn't need an access of writing capabilities. প্রয়োজন নাই. So you can go that granular and say that a bucket, this particular bucket, the only thing it can do is do a write. No reading, no rewriting. It's just one write. So having a control of that granularity, that is a very good practice. Also, making sure that your application, when you're writing your application in the backend, making sure that it can handle dynamic IPs, because you don't want your application to have hard-coded IPs. First of all, that's not safe at all, because if for some reason someone gets to see that coding, your application is pretty compromised at that point. So you want to have a dynamic IP so it can handle that. And that's very important when you're running in cloud, because on the private IPs, it's sort of still not a good practice, but there are a lot of dynamic IPs that gets assigned, especially elastic IPs. So elastic IPs are basically, these are IP addresses that can be attached and detached from one instance to another. So on those kind of situations, it's very easy, very important to have a dynamic IP. And also having a proper test failovers. So whether with elastic IPs or also making sure that your application can do failover. So it's not just important to have a DR and a recovery system. It's also important to make sure that knowing that it works. And so that, when sometimes something's actually happening, you know that where is it breaking. So you don't want to find out why is it breaking or when it's actually breaking down. So a good example of that is, so AWS are one of the biggest customers doing this failover testing. So one of the reasons I say that is annually there's a thing called Chaos Monkey. You guys can Google that if you want. So what that does is, so on that Chaos Monkey day, all their engineers, backend engineers, they get in a room, and what they start doing is they start breaking their live servers, everything in EC2, everything is in AWS, on their live servers. So they're shutting down servers, they're doing and you don't notice it at all. And that happens every year. So that's a good practice, something to know. So a couple of the other things that's helpful when you're choosing the right, from a best practice perspective, is knowing what is the right instance. So, in AWS, there's 175 plus, and we're adding more different types of instances all the time. And these are optimized for different kinds of workloads. So general purpose, there are memory intensive. If you have a high throughput application that needs very fast read-write application, all of that can cover it. Just knowing that what is applicable to you, so that you're not paying extra if not needed, and you're not paying for something, underpaying or overpaying for your application. So knowing that, that's helpful. And there are services AWS, one of them very important, it's called Trusted Advisor. Will, if you allow it to it, and then it can look through your entire infrastructure, and then it does recommendations to you. And these are very good recommendations. And I'll show you some example of that in the coming slides, but that's one way to see that. And then from choosing the right instance, also very important from a cost perspective, best practice would be to know what the right pricing options are. So, from mainly for EC2 and some other services as well, database and all of them, we have different kinds of pricing options that spiky workloads. We have something we have never seen. It's a spiky workload. Use it and then don't pay for it anymore. But it's on demand. If you already know your base workload, that in general, in his example, the Chata server is always running. You know that, so you don't need to pay on demand pricing for it, because you can move into reserve instances. Because reserve instance there is almost 70% discount on hourly rating. The caveat to that is there's a 1 year but 3 year at a reserve instance contract থাকে. But you already know your base workload and you know you're going to use it, so it's always a good idea to move that. And this is a recommendation that you will get from your trusted advisor, that if it will see that if you're running on demand instances on a regular basis, 4 or 5 of them, it will give you recommendation to move into reserve, because you can save money that way. Same goes for another. So these are for regular workloads, running at production level. But then we have what we call a spot instance. So spot instance is mainly for bidding, and this is really good, because spot instance you can get up to 95% of discount on hourly usage. How that works is, so spot instances are mainly instances, these are unused capacity. So AWS infrastructure, if there's an unused capacity, you can bid for how much you want to pay for that, unused capacity. Not necessarily mean you'll be paying that amount. So it could be what you will do is you will set a highest amount of that you are willing to pay. And then we have our regular spot instance rate, whatever is going on. So you're going to start paying from that rate that's set by AWS. And then your higher limit is whatever you want to pay. So once it reaches, if the hourly rate bid reaches the limit that you put in, then you lose that instance. But this is a very good way of to do workloads. Any kind of workloads that you can stop and start again. So any kind of like batch processing related workloads, or if you're doing any kind of analytics related workloads, for that spot instances are really, really good, because you kind of have access to some really high-end. So essentially, have a free IAM would be your first level, and so in I'm sorry. So for IAM, we have our IAM users, security groups, permissions, roles, all of that. So configuring that properly. I'm going to reiterate: list privilege rules all the time. Making sure that no one has, first of all, making sure no one has administrative access, and then limiting who has access to which side of the business. So for example, a database administrator does not need to have an access to a production level application server, and vice versa. A DevOps doesn't need an application, does not need access to the HR side যদি কোনো ধরনের database type. So making sure that having those barriers is very important. And there's ways you can control that. So that's where IAM roles and the security groups are coming in. And then moving on some other ways in a database on a regular basis, we have something called KMS to do the key management services to encrypt the data of whatever you're using. We have what we call security groups. That's basically to control which IP addresses you want to use. And also, if you're opening a port, things like that from a server, from a database side, which ports would be open that port, which particular IP address range it can have access to between a particular port for a particular IP. What I mean by that is, so if you open it for incoming traffic, it will also open it for outgoing traffic. That is very important to know. But you control that with network access control list or NACLs. that's a stateful service, is that you have to particularly specify what are the incoming traffics are going to be, and then what are the outgoing traffics are going to be. And then on top of that, we have what we call VPC. So that is, you're controlling your private subnet, your public subnet. In a private subnet, what are some of the IP addresses are getting access to? So কোনটার সাথে কার connection আছে. So specifying those, so having a proper control over that. Also having proper NAT gateways, and then internet gateways connection. So NAT gateways would be something that is used by private subnets. So for example, in this in this diagram, if you want to think of your HTTP 433, that's open. This is the ELB, so this is connected to your internet gateway. So that is controlling all the incoming traffics, but not necessarily the EC2, this private subnet and the database. They don't need to be in public subnets. They can be private, and then any kind of updates or anything that you a NAT gateway. So having those granular controls over who that you control the flow of the traffic. And a good example of that is this is a very straightforward, simple example of how the security groups would be working if we set something like that. One thing I mentioned, like this is a stateless, so incoming and outgoing, it's going to be both open. So if you want to control that, that would be you implement NACL for it. But what is happening here is so there's a web layer, and then we have our app layer, and then database server. So the web layer, it needs traffic. So this is only on port 80, it's accepting all the traffics, incoming and outgoing. But for TCP connection for port 22, it's only kind of collecting from a management or MGMT security group. So management security groups are, and then on the app service, management security group is something that's just sitting here. So this is the bastion host sitting there. And then the app server is doing the same thing. It's only accepting the traffic from your web. It's not accepting traffic from anywhere else except for web or database. And then also since there is a bastion host, you don't necessarily need to have a bastion host. There are ways around to do that. But that's a different conversation. But in this case, it's accessing only from bastion. And then same for database server, is that the database server does not need to necessarily have access to your web directly. So it has your main access through your application. And then on the contrary, management, it's only accessing, it has its own IP address, and it's only accessing you can access the bastion host only from this particular IP address. So this is a very, very simplified example of how you can control traffic. And these are some of the rules that you will create and have control over the usage of your infrastructure. So one other very important thing that we'll talk is, implementing elasticity. So this is the auto scaling part that we were talking about before, is that, so in a good example of this is, so think this is an example of, on-premise, if you have something, or if you don't have auto scaling, how that works. That is that, so in this example, so you have a provisioned capacity, meaning that you set it up where it could be on-premise, you are running your data center, and আপনি যেটা run করছেন সেটাই, but you don't have any auto scaling here. So what that will happen is, so you are provisioning on a higher level. So you have all these great area, these are unused capacity. So you're wasting money in this case. And then you have these sort of 90-degree sharp, and then you're getting 404 errors or any kind of errors. So basically, end users are seeing bad performances here. So you're not only losing money, in some cases, your users experiencing trouble, bad website experience as well. So that's where auto scaling is coming in. So what it does is, this is you create triggers and a lot of triggers based on, it could be custom. It also can be through something as simple as your CPU utilization. It could be something like your network, incoming network, having that kind of, based on those matrices, you trigger to either scale up or scale down. So implementing that is very important, because that's, in this case, what it's doing is it is matching matching your need, whether you have a 90-degree sharp or you're not, you having a slow day and you don't need that many services. So one of the things here is, in addition to auto scaling, there are some other ways to, you can, make that step up faster as well. So that could be, there's something called warm-ups. There's something called, what do we call it? Controlled drained connection, because auto scaling is not only important for incoming traffics and things like that. It is also integrates with your elastic load balancer. So when you creating an auto scaling role or auto scaling group, you can connect to your elastic load balancer and relate that with your auto scaling group. And what that is actually does is, elastic load balancer, it has a capability of doing health checks. It does periodic health checks, whether there's a traffic or not. So what that means is, if for some reason it says that it's failing the health check, so on the elastic load balancer, when you're setting up the auto scaling group, there is a minimum amount of server you want to run. So one of the examples we have বলছিলেন যে 4 servers are running all the time. So you want to make sure that it runs 4 servers. And that is something elastic load balancer can make sure. And this is a completely automated process. It's not manual. So what it's doing is, if it fails the health check, it basically drains the failed instance, and then it uses an AMI, it uses the auto scaling group to spin up a brand new instance, and then have the minimum baseline amount of instances, so that you're not experiencing any kind of what do you call it? Your end users are not experiencing any of that downtime. So something broke down, that's okay, that's normal. So, and you're not paying anything extra for that either, because if you're shutting down an instance, you're not paying for it anymore, and then your auto scaling group is just spinning one back up. But these are the things, these are the triggers, these are the auto scaling correlation that you need to configure yourself. So being conscious about that. Also knowing what's a good trigger. So if it's 30% or is it 50%? So what is a good trigger? Because if it's 30% maybe, and if it's spiking from 30 to 100, knowing that what would be some of the proper solutions for that, either moving into a little bit of bigger instance so that it doesn't see a sudden spike and completely breaks it down, or playing around with the trigger limit, so that you don't see the idea is that you don't see a sharp increase in usage, and that breaks down your entire infrastructure. So playing around with that. So yeah, these are some of the guidance that I was talking about. We already talked about most of these. Just being resilient, for reboot and relaunch, which you'll be doing with your elastic load balancer, having a proper auto scaling policies, and then leveraging managed services. So we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the examples that came up was, they're using Lambda. So that case, if you're using Lambda, you're not worried about any of the auto scaling policies or anything like that at all. It's not important, because that is managed for you. AWS is responsible for that. So if that's a use case for it, if it's needed for you, then knowing that if you should use that. Also, some of the options would be, using DynamoDB for your maintaining your like caching sessions and things like that, so that you're not losing the data if something happens. So after that, one of the other best practices that I want to talk about is, this is an important one, is microservices, or basically making your services loosely coupled. So the idea is, in an aeroplane or any kind of, even on the new cars, we have something called a black box. So what a black box does is, it lets you see that what are some of the particular outputs that are coming in, and what are the inputs that are going in. so that it's easier to troubleshoot. So that's the idea as well in AWS as well. কারণ আমরা যেটা বলি যে AWS এ everything is an API call. That's actually literally everything. So it can be something from spinning up a server or logging into, if you want to run a high-level infrastructure, everything is an API call. And what that allows you to do is, so all the 175 plus 180 services that we have, all of them has, for their every of the actions it can do, there is a particular API call for it. So what you should do is when you're using creating your infrastructure, it's always the best idea to break down your applications in small microservices. So if it's, your application will if it's a web-based, the most common would be there would be a web part of it, there would be an application backend part of it. It's always a good idea to break those down. And there are several reasons for it. So one of them is it makes it very easy to troubleshoot. It makes it very easier to monitor. So if you need to scale up or scale down, so if you're seeing a spike of traffic coming in, but how is it overall performing? What are the issues? You can see that. It's easy to troubleshoot that. And then in between, you can set up different services. So in this figure, যেটা আমার কাছে আছে সেটা হচ্ছে যে, having SQS. SQS is called simple just queue service. This is one of the first AWS services. So just having a queue, if it's running and it can subscribe to a topic, and then your app server or your web server or any kind of workload, they can subscribe to those queuing service and do workloads like that. And then you can publish some of the topics using SNS. So SNS is simple notification service. So just knowing that your queuing is going properly, and then having that proper notification and publication as well. So that way it just makes it easier. And then moving on, what are some of the other with EC2 you can utilize in this case is something like Lambda, because SQS, SNS, these services, they're very well integrated with Lambda. So what it can allow you to do is you can trigger a particular thing, and the automation that I was talking about, make that automation really easy. So for example is, if you're, very easy example is if your app server sees something, it triggers an SQS, it sees the queue, that queue is taking some data in, that instance is putting the data in an S3 bucket. Once the data is in an S3 bucket, you can trigger a Lambda function to trigger some particular any kind of work that you can do. So that Lambda function can do something as simple as, if it sees a new object in that S3 bucket, it's going to do something. What is it going to do? That's something, that's up to you. If you want to trigger any kind of analytics, any kind of workload that you want to trigger. So this is a very simple example, but it's just, the idea is to automate all of that process. You're not manually looking at it all the time. And the thing with automation is it's less prone to errors. So joto manual intervention কমানো সম্ভব ততটা better এই ব্যাপারগুলো any kind of error reduce করার জন্য, এবং it makes things much more consistent. So as I mentioned, like these are some of the examples of what are some of the things you can do with API calls, including queuing, if you want doing video transcoding, database, emails, machine learning, big data analytics, any kind of workload that you can think of. And I don't have a slide for it, but one of the services I highly encourage you to look into is, it's called CloudFormation. So CloudFormation is all these that we talked about, the infrastructure, S3 bucket, creating a VPC, all of that. You can have all of that as a code. So the idea of CloudFormation is on AWS, and it's, for the best part, it's free. You're not paying anything for having a CloudFormation. But what you're doing is you basically convert your entire infrastructure as a code. So you codify the entire infrastructure. It's written in either JSON or YAML format. And what you're going to be doing is specifying, basically codify which EC2 instance you want to use, which kind of workload, as in, what kind of database, what kind of VPC you want to spin up, which AMI user, anything, all of that we just talked about, you can codify all of that using CloudFormation. And what you create is a template. And then what that allows you to do is, you have you have a very portable template. So you can have, if you have a multiple different projects, you can have a very baseline template of how your infrastructure is going to look like, and then use that and then build on top of it. So it just creates consistency, it's less error, and it's easier for every team to manage that code as well. So I don't have I don't have a slide for it, but that's a very useful service to look into. And that CloudFormation works with anything. So it's not just EC2. It's EC2, Lambda, any kind of workload that you can think of. It's mixed. It's compatible with all of that. So EC2, that's all I have for from the compute side and the EC2 side. I know we're running a little bit high up, but if you guys have some if you guys are open for time, I can go on. I know we talked about a lot of stuff. So Nashid bhai, is that okay if I keep moving on?
আমার মনে হয় ওকে, সবাই সময় আছে। সো আমরা হয়তো মানে আমরা 10টা থেকে 11টা ছিল, বাট উই ক্যান এক্সটেন্ড, মানে দিস ইজ এ ভেরি গুড সেশন, আমরা সবাইকে জানতে পারছি। আর হাবিব, তারিক, তুমি ইফ ইউ ফিল, আপনি যদি ফিল করেন, সো আপনি বাংলাও বলেন, ইংলিশে বলেন, সো দ্যাট পিপল ক্যান অলসো রিলেট। সো কারো কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন থাকলে উই ক্যান ডেফিনেটলি অ্যাড্রেস, না হলে আমরা একটু উই ক্যান কন্টিনিউ, বিকজ আমরা খুব ভালো একটা এক্সাইটিং সেশনের মধ্যে আছি। তো সবাই ইটস ওকে, আমরা যদি আর কিছু এক্সটেন্ড করি।
Yeah, sure.
All right, perfect. Up to you, Tariq.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I have time. All right. Yeah, as I was putting best practice, there's a lot of stuff, so I was struggling to create sort of compacted as well. But moving on to mainly from EC2, the main thing that I was kind of wanted to talk about is different storage. What are the options and what you can do, and what are some of the best practices for it? But before deciding that, let's see what are some of the factors that what your application needs. What are some of the requirements for the product? So it could be, so in the diagram you're seeing, so we have redundancy, durability, availability. We have object size, and then we're also talking about access frequency. So what I mean by that is how redundant do you want your objects to be? If it's a very important file that it needs to be in, you need to have several copies, or if there's any compliances that you're working with, you can have redundancy, have a cross-region replication, have proper redundancy in there. If there's an object size, how will that work? How much durable do you want that? How much durable do you want your objects or files that you want to put it? What level of performance? So is it a file that you're using that requires a very fast input output, high throughput? That is important. Or how available do you want it? Meaning that does it needs to be in one region versus the other? Also, how, this is a very important one, is how often do you need to access that file? So if it's a file that's, this is only for a DR, if something breaks down, or there's a, do you want to learn to talk? I'm sorry, I missed the question. Okay, I thought there was a question. Sorry about that. So yeah, knowing the access frequency, and that's very important because that can vary the cost on a very high basis. Is that the files that you want to save, or the files that you want to store, how often do you need to access that? So we'll talk about all of that. And what that leads to is that when you're leveraging a storage, it's not a one size for everything. So we have, for particular workload, for particular type of storage, there are particular types of services. So I kept mentioning EBS, so that's the block storage. This is your persistent block storage. This is something you're attaching to your EC2 instance, meaning that this is, think of it on a regular computer, your different hard drive volumes. So your volume D, volume C, your root volumes. So these are block storage. So what that means is when you need to change a file, you can change. What happens is when you're putting a file in that block storage, it gets stored as a block in that storage, and each block has a particular address. And what it's doing is, if something needs to be changed in that file, it's not changing the entire file. What that does, it's very fast because it's changing only that particular block, চেঞ্জটা প্রয়োজন, and it leaves the entire file untouched. So it's very high throughput. So that's why it's good for as a root volume and things like that. But versus something like S3 is your object storage. So what I mean by that is, so object storage is when you're storing a file, what it does is it stores it in a bucket with a metadata, and then it stores that entire file as an object. So if something needs to be changed, it changes the entire file. So that's how it works. It's very resilient. It's very high, extremely highly durable, but it's not as fast as your block storage. So it's knowing that when to use that. Some of the other is, so you'll see that very common is EC2 instance storage. So instance storage is also block level storage, but so this is an ephemeral storage, meaning that instance storage is only available to you the time you're running an EC2 instance. So it's never very much advised that you put anything in the instance storage. You need to save it for later work. So you can have any kind of scripts, if you need to run it as a block storage, you can put it in instance storage, but you need to make sure that there's a copy of it, because what happens is if you shut down that EC2 instance, or you're doing an auto scaling group or scaling up or scaling down, or health check fails, if for any reason you lose that EC2 instance, you lose that instance storage as well. Nothing is saved. So just knowing that, so that's the big difference between EBS volumes and instance storage. And also based on what kind of instance types you're going to be using, you can't always have instance storage attached to it. So that's something to know and something to be aware about. And then we have RDS. So RDS these are particularly designed for your database storage, relational database storage particularly. CloudFront, this is our CDN. So CDN means that you can cache your websites in particular and have a cached version of that in different parts of the region, different parts of the world. You can utilize CloudFront for that. If you don't want to have have your infrastructure up and running in an entire region, all in all, you can have a cached version of that in CloudFront. DynamoDB, this is more for your non-relational database storage. So this is going to be for things like like session data, very easy one. So this is usually the non-relational. Very common one is to use a JSON format and things like that. So it mainly works with the key pair value. So this is very high, fast throughput kind of workloads. If you want to use that for non-relational work, that's good for it. Also Elasticache. So sometimes the session data, it works really well with like your Elasticache. It's the Redis and Memcached. I don't know too much about it on full disclosure, but it's a very good practice to have, in between your on practice. If you have a app layer and if you have a database layer in between, you will probably it would be a good practice to have an Elasticache, which will manage your session data, session information, and have a queue in between. So what that will do is, if you need to, if for some reason the one of the app server goes down, it's not necessarily you're not losing data from your user sessions. So for things like that, it's easy. It's a good practice to have Elasticache, have some session data in between. So yeah. So the idea of talking about all of that is that knowing যে আপনার কখন কোন ধরনের স্টোরেজটা ইউজ করাটা better, and also making sure that it's optimum with your cost and it's also optimum with your performance. Obviously security is an important part of it as well, but we address the security from a whole overall perspective anyway, but in general, when you're using it, these are going to be the two main things that you're going to be thinking about: cost and performance. And then this is just an example of what I was just talking about. So in this example, we have your Elastic Load Balancer, and then in the VPC, there's multiple web instances that's running, but then we have a relational database. But what would be a good practice is, for that web application, you have some static files, like your website are going to be the chobi, or website are going to writing, all of that. These are static files that doesn't need to be changed. So not necessarily that doesn't change that often. So you don't need to have that in an EBS volume because this is a more expensive, high fast throughput type of storage. So what you can do is you can store those in S3 bucket as an object file, and then use CloudFront to access those files. And that's actually one of the ways if you're running a serverless website, that would you be doing it. But what that allows you to do is it's more cost effective and it's also more faster. So that's one option. And then on a little step up from that is that you are using DynamoDB or Elasticache. Either one works. So a DynamoDB could hold some of the your user session data, as I mentioned. So this just makes your application more stateless. And then in between the web instance, Elasticache is something that also can work. And then also if you want to push some of the data to maybe if you're collecting some information, cookies or this kind of information from the user, you can push those into DynamoDB and then not store that in an EBS volume. So that is the idea, that knowing what kind of files or what kind of workload data do you have and then pushing that into the right storage option. So that. So moving on from that, from best practice perspective, I will focus most of it in the storage in S3. So the main couple of things that I will talk about is the cost and performance, and then also security and data protection, which is going to be very important because since you're storing, you want to make sure it's protected. And then finally, monitoring in general is that how to properly monitor your storage. And also I'll go tie some of that back to EC2 side as well. So first of all, what are some of the costs from a cost perspective? What are some of the factors when you're putting something in S3? So you have a storage, request and retrieval is very important. Monitoring, we'll talk more about that in later, and then also data transfer and storage management and things like that. So what I mean by that is those are some of the factors, because when you're storing something in S3, you're not only paying for just the storage. That is something to be aware of, because there are costs associated with data egress, meaning data incoming and outgoing. So in AWS, there is no cost for data incoming. So if you're putting a file in AWS, you're uploading it, there is no cost to it. But if you're downloading it, so you're taking it out of AWS, there is a data egress out charge. So that is something to be aware of. And then also when you're doing any kind of operations. So as I mentioned, that these are metadata related object files. So you do, your get requests, put requests, things like that. So those requests, so these are called data-driven events. So these kind of data-driven events, that has a cost. It's very nominal. If I remember correctly, I think it's like 10 cents for 100,000 requests or things like that. But it's very nominal, but that is something to know, that there is a cost associated with it. Retrievals. So retrieval, we'll talk about that in the next slide, that some of the tiers, because S3 is not just all in one. There are several tiers for S3. So some of those tiers has a retrieval fee, meaning that আপনি যখন data store করছেন, তখন there's certain storage cost. It's usually cheaper, and then there is a retrieval cost when you're retrieving it. And then, as I also already talked about, data transfer and then storage management as well. So knowing that, and then a monitor to নিয়ে পরে কথা বলবোই বললাম. So moving to that, just to talk about the cost factors, just the classes, and knowing that which class to use that's an important part of having the best practice in AWS in S3, because you want to make sure that you're not spending too much. That's always an important part of it. So in S3, we always talk about S3, but there are literally, so we have right now at the moment, six tiers. So some of these are new. So we have the intelligent tiering and the one zone. Those are some of the newer ones. So, but the idea is to give a little bit of background. What I was trying to say is, so tying back to it, like how durable do you want your data or the application recursive data to be? What is the access frequency, and also what's the availability and the durability. So you have an S3 standard, as I said. So this is think of it, it could be something as a good, it's not a good analogy, but something would be, Dropbox or something. This is, you uploaded it, given that you have an access to it, you can download it, use it, have instance access to that data as you're using it. So this would be good for, as in the previous one of the examples that I mentioned, that for the static file, if you're storing that static file after website run করার জন্য, so you would want to store that in S3 standard because your users are going to be accessing that data on a regular basis. So সেটার জন্য, that's your S3 standard. It's about $22 per terabyte per month cost. So this is your regular access. From there, so I'll talk about the intelligent tiering in a minute, because that's a little bit different. Not different, but it has some different caveats to it. But moving to that, from S3 standard, we have what we call an S3 standard infrequent access. So infrequent access, it's still for data, this would be a little bit cheaper. So this is cheaper as in, so it's about $12.5 or $13 per terabyte. So this is for files that you still need instance access, but you don't, when you needed instance access, but you're not regularly accessing that. So what they will do is, for storage, you're paying half the price than the standard, but this is where the retrieval fee comes in. So per gigabyte, there is a retrieval fee for it. And then pushing from there, if you have, so these would be kind of data that you can recreate. So you need regular access to it, but you have some data that, if it gets lost or if it's, gets damaged or anything like that in any way, you can still have, so you can still recreate that data. So it's much more cheaper. So this is $10 a gigabyte, $10 a terabyte per month. But then there is a retrieval fee for it. So the main difference between standard infrequent access versus one zone is, so in S3 standard, the data is replicated for redundancy. This is replicated around 3 availability zones. Same for S3 standard infrequent access as well. But for S3 one zone infrequent access, it's only available in one zone, in one availability zones. So what that changes from availability and durability perspective, সেটা হচ্ছে যে, so to put a little bit of maths into it, so we say that in S3 there is 11 nines of durability. So you can have an S3, you can put your data and have you can achieve up to 11 nines of durability, meaning that it could be in an entire year span. If you put a file, there is 99 point, and then there's 9 nines after that. So 99999. So there's 99% chances of availability in regular S3 standard. Same for S3 standard infrequent access. That goes down a little bit when you are, so I think it's like five nines when you have it in only in one availability zones. So the percentage goes down. So mathematically বলতে গেলে, so on an S3 standard or any of the other S3 tiers, if you put a file, আপনার once in every 100 billion years file একবার loss হওয়ার chances আছে. That's the mathematical idea. So moving back to it, as I was saying, so from one zone, so these are for the files that you need instance access, like you were using it on a daily basis. It's files for those. But what about files like your archival type of data? So that's, if you have something like that, that's when we move to Glacier. So what Glacier does, or Glacier and Glacier Deep Archives. So there's 2 different tiers of storage. So this is going to be for your archival, in a sense. These are the files that you need, either for some kind of compliance or data recovery. So this is something that you are accessing probably once a year or once every 2 years or 6 months or something like that. Number one, that's one of the criteria. And then the second criteria is that when you need to retrieve that data, you have some time to wait. So what I mean by that is, so first the S3 Glacier. So it's extremely cheap compared to the S3 standard. It's S3 standard ছিল $21 per terabyte per month. আর এখানে Glacier হচ্ছে $4 per terabyte per month. Same availability, same durability, 11 nines. But আপনার যখন retrieve করতে হবে, so there is a retrieval fee associated with it, and there's time. So this could be somewhere between 3 to 4 minutes to up to 12 hours. So the faster you want, the higher the retrieval fee is going to be. So knowing that, so that is the caveat to paying $4 a terabyte. And then for files that are even more, you access it even more infrequently, that's where you go to the deep cold storage. That's called Glacier Deep Archive. So that's even cheaper. So that's 75% cheaper than Glacier. So it's $1 a terabyte per month. But the retrieval time for that is between 12 hours to 48 hours. Of course, there's a retrieval fee for that as well. So knowing that, where you need to put your data and what would be what would be appropriate for the data. So this is important to have a cost saving, when you have running a bigger infrastructure. If you're saving, especially for database, for any kind of disaster recovery, DR strategy, if you're doing it, knowing where to put it properly, it will be very important. And then knowing the differences. And then finally, the intelligent tiering that I was talking about. So what that does is you put it on, so when you first put anything in intelligent tiering, it's available to you as you are specifying it. So it could be standard. And then what it's doing is it on the background, it does analyzes the access pattern of the data. So this would be for data you not necessarily know that how often you will access it, but you want to make sure that you're not paying too much for it. So what it does is it's actually it uses SageMaker machine learning in the background, and it has a model that's constantly getting better, and it's accessing checking the pattern, your usage pattern, and then based on that it will move it for you. So if it sees that you're not accessing a file on a regular basis, it will move the file to an infrequent access, or if it sees that if you're not even accessing the infrequent access that often, then it will just move it to S3 Glacier as well. So that's something that's done automatically for you. You're not paying anything extra for it, or you're not, in general looking for it. So that's the automated process. But what that does is, we'll talk about the life cycle in a minute. But you can do all of that work manually as well to do move it from one tier to another. But some of the best practices for AWS when you're have your objects on S3 buckets. So first of all, is making sure that it has the correct policy, and also very importantly, never ever have your bucket open for public. I'll talk more about that, and I have some slides for it. But making sure that you do not open your buckets for your public. Always keep that blocked. Same thing. Practice least privilege access. Have IAM policies, proper IAM policies, to make sure that what roles are you going to be using, who's going to be using it, and who has access to the bucket. Very important one would be, so the multiple authentication factor that I was talking about. You can enable that for any deletion. So meaning that if someone needs to delete something from a bucket, that will need, first of all, they will need proper permission through IAM. And then on top of that, when they have permission, they need to do a multiple authentication, meaning that they'll need to put in a password, their password, and then also do a multiple authentication through your email, or the usual multiple MFA way, and then delete it. So it just adds that extra step, making sure that no one just by accident deletes anything. And then also we also have a versioning. If that's needed, you can turn that on as well. I didn't write that down, but the versioning is just mainly what it does is when you have a file, you can create, you can turn it on to have multiple versions. So that is also another layer to delete anything, because what that does is it keeps the version, like previous versions of your file. So even if you delete something, what that does is it puts a delete marker on that object file. So if you have versioning turned on, you can delete that delete marker, and then you will have your file back. So that's one way to have a protection on your deletion. And you can, I included a link, so link that you can see more options or more in details about or some of the other best practices about on the security practices. And then, so these are some of the things that's you should always implement it. And then in addition to that, actually here I missed one thing, having an encryption. So I'll talk about the data transit and data encryption in a minute because I have a separate slide for it. And then some extra ones we have is, so having a data encryption at rest, and then also in transit, having an object lock. So object lock is, if you have a particular file that you need to have a proper object locking, meaning making sure that no one can delete it, no one can make any changes to it. So having that. I already talked about the versioning. Also on top of that, you can create cross-region replication. If that's something important to you, you can do that as well. Also, when your infrastructure, when your application is accessing it, make sure to use VPC endpoints. So what that means is, your VPC, those are your availability zones. And so when you're creating your EC2 instance and infrastructure, those are, these are availability zone-wise services versus an S3, this is a regional service. Mane hocche je S3 is entirely managed by AWS and it's available to the entire region. So what that means is you cannot directly implement an S3 to your infrastructure. It's not that you get a small chunk of it. But what you do get is it's called endpoints. So what that allows you to do is making sure when you have a VPC, you're in your infrastructure, you have your VPC running, and it needs to connect to an S3. How does it do it? So it does it through a VPC endpoint, meaning that it's not a good practice to have. Of course, you can have that access through internet, meaning that your VPC or your request will go out to the internet and then connect to the AWS, and then connect to your S3 bucket and get the data in. But that's not the best practice because why would you want to go out on the open internet if you don't need to? So what you would do is you create a VPC endpoint. So what that does is basically a tunnel between your S3 bucket and then your VPC. So this is all in the entire traffic goes through Amazon backend. That's not open to the internet at all. So it just adds an extra layer of security that your data is not traveling on the open internet. And then, also same thing with S3 access points. So it's the same thing. You just creating particular, particular access points for your application to connect into for your bucket. So these are some of the, these are best practices that you should implement based on your application. If it needs it, you have the option to do it. Also having layers of control. Same thing, bucket policies. So I already talked about that a little bit with IAMs, but we also have what we call a bucket policy. So that's just two layers. So you have your regular IAM access policies and then bucket policies, and then they all need to match in for a user to do anything. Just like a network access control list, S3 also has its own control list. So you can change control the rule and have a recommendation on, have more granular control on who can have access to it. So who can have access to it? So just that. I have another slide for it. I think it changed a little bit, so I have it in the coming slides. Okay. So intelligent tiering, I already talked about it, so I'm just gonna skip this. But just to give you an idea, just a visualization. So it just uses SageMaker, and SageMaker it's constantly looking into what's the usage pattern for the data, and then based on that, it's pushing it through the frequent access or infrequent access. That's the main idea here. And there's no overhead, and it costs the same. And okay, so from there, so one thing is the lifecycle policy. I think let's see, okay, I'll come back to that. But yeah, so going back to the lifecycle policy that I was talking about. So a lifecycle policy is something so what the intelligent tiering is doing. This is something you don't necessarily need to implement if you don't want to. You can have a control on your own of how you want to do it. So what that is, say if you have a file that you need to keep for, so one of the example is some of the financial institutes or things like that, they need to keep a record of a file for 5 years or 6 years or something like that. And it's very, even 5-6 years is a long time, but even after a couple of months, it's really easy to forget that you don't need that file anymore. And the thing with AWS is you're paying for what you're using. So if you're not deleting it and it's still there, you're going to be still paying for it. And you don't want that. So in that case, what you can do is create a lifecycle policy. So what that does is if you need the file for 1 month on a regular standard, have a lifecycle policy from that to move that to directly to archive, or if you need it for infrequent access, move it to infrequent access, and then deep archive in this example, as you see. But then, after, so in this example, we talked about 2 months, say, that you don't need the file for after 2 months. So have a delete lifecycle policy for 2 months. So after 2 months, it's done. The file's automatically going to get deleted. And then once it gets deleted, when you can have a notification sent out as well, meaning that you can utilize SNS notifying whoever's in charge of that bucket that, hey, just so you know, this is reaching its end of life and it will be deleted after that certain date. So you will have that supervision and overvision. That's part of the monitoring. But if you don't need to intervene anything, you won't be doing anything. It's just gonna do its thing, completely automated, no supervision needed. So lifecycle policy is very important to make sure that you're not overpaying for any of that. Basically the cost management and the data management. So that's the idea. So that's the example here, that from 30 days it's moving to S3 standard, and then after 365 days it moves to deep archive. So it easily could be that after 365 days you just delete it. But that's the main differences between the lifecycle policy and the intelligent tiering, is that knowing what data to use. So for lifecycle policies would be good for, these are good for files that that কতদিন আপনার রাখতে হবে এবং কতদিন পরে জিনিসটা ডিলিট করে দিতে হবে ফাইলটা. If you know that already and you know the perfect exact creation date, by all means, it's always a good idea to use lifecycle policy. You know what it is. You don't need to complicate things. But if you have some files that's new kind of application, new kind of projects, then you can put it into intelligent tiering, and then you will see that what are the usage pattern, and then based on that, you can, moving on, then you can have a lifecycle policy based on that. So it's just for that known workload versus unknown workload. So making sure which is good for which, what kind of objectives. And then some of the things to know that makes it easier, and also best practices as well, is to do batch processing in your S3 bucket. So we'll talk about, so tagging is a very important part of it. So whenever you are creating a bucket or creating a file, always make sure to tag it. So it doesn't matter if it's in standard or if it's in Glacier or Deep Archive or anything like that. It just makes it easier for you to, if you want to do any kind of operation, you can do batch operations on it. So it could be something like a data event, so like copying objects or deleting objects, or if you need to restore something. So what I mean by that is you need to move certain files from Deep Archive or from archive to S3 standard for some kind of usage. If you need to move all of that, you really don't want to move one file at a time. It's not ideal. And also it just makes it hard, more easier to have some kind of error, because একটা জিনিস যত বারবার করছেন manual intervention হচ্ছে, it just makes it more easier to have some kind of error. You don't want that. So what you do is tag it. And so the way tagging works is a key value pair. So you have a key and then associated with it a value. The key could be anything. It could be a name, it could be just project, and then you just associate whatever value you want to associate with it. So in this case, you see this, it says project and the value is delta. So when you need to filter or do any kind of batch operation, it's that easy that you just you're doing a filtration or doing the operations based on just whichever tags have that key value, and then do a batch operation that way. It just makes the all of your workload and doing that so much faster and easier, just like that. So it doesn't take long to when you're setting things up to have a tag, but down the road it just makes your uh, overall resource management so much easier. And it's also actually much more easier to do. Tagging is very important, not just for S3. Tagging is also important for your your EC2 and any kind of resources that you run, because AWS supports tagging for all of the resources that it's running, and comes in very handy when you're doing cost analysis or any kind of budgeting. So if you have a proper tagging, it's just so easy to manage those resources properly. If you want to set a budget for certain EC2 instances, if you have proper tagging, it's super easy to maintain that. So that's just an idea. So yeah, tagging definitely a best practice. So some of the access control lists I was talking about, same thing, having a proper IAM, having a bucket policy, tagging we already talked about, and then I'm going to talk about the access control lists. I have slides for it right here. So this is the slide I was talking about. It sort of got moved, but the differences between IAM user policy and the bucket policy. So to give you a little bit of perspective is, it's IAM is mainly for permission from a user perspective, meaning what can this user do in AWS or in this particular service, or what kind of actions it can do. So that is something you control with IAM, user policy. But then your S3 bucket policies, which you're creating, that you will specify that who can access it. So if there's a mismatch, it won't work properly. So you need to have that proper matching of that. And also, it's with IAM, you're also on the, I already gave another example, Jay. At a user, she কি ধরনের action করতে পারবে, meaning that reading, writing, get requests, put requests, copy requests, এগুলো করতে পারবে কিনা সেটার যে পারমিশনটা সেটা আপনাকে দিতে হবে হচ্ছে IAM user policy দিয়ে. But S3 bucket, that would control things like, okay, এই বাকেটে ওভারঅল দ্য এন্টায়ার বাকেট কেউ কোনো ধরনের কপি করতে পারবে কিনা, কেউ কোনো ধরনের ডিলিশন করতে পারবে কিনা. That kind of, if you want to have that level of policies set into an entire bucket, for that you will use a bucket policy. And then also IAM is more important for, it's more common for all AWS services, versus obviously bucket policy is more important for that. And bucket policy, it has a very distinct usage. সেটা হচ্ছে যে if you have multiple accounts, you need to give access to a bucket from another account, that is something that needs to be done through bucket policy. So you can do that without using an IAM rule. That's an option. So that's just knowing what kind of workload that is. And then something that AWS always does, same thing, practicing the least privilege policies, is buckets are private by default. So if you need to make a bucket public, which is a very bad practice, you need to do it by yourself. It's not done by default. It will never be. When you're creating a bucket, any bucket, it's private by default. And you actually get multiple warning signs letting you know that this is not a good practice to have your buckets open in the public. Okay, so actually we talked about the VPC endpoints before. So this is just an illustration for it. So mainly that, as I was saying, like you have your EC2 instance, it needs to access the S3. What it's doing is going through the internet gateway, and then through the internet it's accessing the S3, but not a good practice. So what you want to do is just have an IAM policy, and then using VPC endpoints, it's just accessing the VPC endpoint, creates a peer between the S3 endpoints and the VPC, and it's accessing the data, all of that in the back end, of AWS. So no outside connection. Um, Going back to it a little bit over like what the public access is. So this basically means that, you know, so if you, this is actually something funny to see. If you play around with different websites around the world, it's try to see the source code. A lot of the times it will tell you what bucket it's using, because uh, yeah, some of the websites doesn't properly mask the name of the bucket, and then a lot of the times if you try to access the bucket, if it's set to public, you can see all the contents in that bucket. So that's what means by having a public access. So it's just full on. You can, if you can access the content of your of your the content of the bucket through any through over the internet, that's public access, and that's not a good idea. So you need to have that this is where the access control lists are also coming in, that controls that who would have access to that particular bucket, also the bucket policy and all of that. So this is sort of a bucket policy. If you have a public access, so it will tell you that what are, so this would be a bucket policy if with something that has a public access, I'm trying to say. So anything that with star means that's just God mode. It's giving access to everything. And then also resources, it's giving access to all the resources. And then this is the action that you would specify. So you're saying that put object, this is an API call for S3 put objects. The effect of that is it's allowed. So the effect can be allowed or denied. In this case, it's allowed. So this is one of the example of what could be look like if you have a public bucket. So what that means is, in principle, all of it, all the resources are available to you, available to public, and then the actions they can do, put objects, that action, and the effect of that is all of that is allowed, which is very bad practice. That's not safe at all. And then also, but something to know, I have it at the bottom, it's that if you have a cross account access, that is not a public access, because what you're doing in that case is, you remember that access points that I was talking about, the S3 bucket, you can create an access point. So what that would happen is so when you do a cross account connection between S3 buckets, you access the bucket through the access points. So that doesn't go out on the internet. So that is not a public access. Finally, very important one from a security perspective is encryption. So encryption is two ideas, mainly encryption in transit, meaning that if it's traveling through the internet, how is it doing it if it needs to travel? So it would be, we have support HTTPS, and then we're also supporting TLS, and then also encryption at rest. So that can be done server-sided. Server-sided meaning that when the data is in an S3 bucket, তখন encryption টা করা হতে পারে, অথবা it could be also done on the client side, meaning that when you are pushing the data from your side to AWS, you can already do the encryption yourself and then push it. We have both options, whichever is easier. And then for managing the key for the encryption, that's up to you as well. You can use KMS, which is an AWS service, key management service. What basically doing is it's a managed key management service for you. So you can create a key pair from there, or if you have your own key pair, if you want to manage it through KMS, you can do that. You can manage all of that yourself. So this would be the SSEC. So you're creating the key, the trust, the key pair, and then you will be managing it yourself. All of that is that's dependent on you. So whichever is easier for you. So you have full control over that. So it supports both of that. And this is something to note from a best practice perspective, is that this is not a default. So encryption, when you're creating a bucket, এটা by default on করা না, because there is a question of key management and all of that, since there's so many options. So this is not the option or feature that's turned on by default. But if you have sensitive data, it's always very good practice to have that turned on, and it's literally a check mark or one API call, and then have that. And that same goes for not only for S3, it's also for your database service, any kind of RDS, DynamoDB, all of that. It's also EBS as well, is to have that, to have encryption turned on. So yeah. One of the things we also say, এখানে আমরা আমাদের কিছু client we sometimes talk about is, what if the government says, hand us over all the data? You hear that kind of requests from clients all the time, especially in the commercial side. And the answer is, I mean, if there's a valid reason and there's proper legal options going through, AWS has to comply. But it is, if your data is encrypted, that is something that's not in our control. AWS is not responsible for it. So if they, and you're controlling the data and all of that. So just knowing this little bit of quirks is very helpful to make sure that your data is in integrity of the data. So same thing as well, these are some of the things I already talked about, is that these are a lot of the default encryption that you need to turn on. It doesn't do anything by default. So this is something you need to turn on yourself. And finally, important one, this is a very vast topic, but we're reaching at the end almost. I'm going to talk about like the monitoring of the resources. We talked about like CloudWatch and CloudTrail. So these are the two main monitoring applications, services that you will use in AWS. So CloudWatch is for your data and performance matrices. What I mean by that is, so when you're doing auto scaling, for example, so it's checking your usage of CPU utilization or network traffic by default, and this is something that it sees all those matrices through CloudWatch. CloudWatch is collecting all of that, and that's triggering everything. So what it does is it creates actionable insights, meaning that you can create a Lambda function to trigger something. You can create a basically trigger an action and automate some work. You can, auto scaling is already an automation in action. Also, if someone needs to be notified, if someone needs to know what's going on, you can create an SNS topic and make sure that the CloudWatch pushes the SNS notifications to proper people. So if the sysadmin needs to know that all of a sudden in one zone, all the EC2 instances are going down, that is something that they need to know. So things like that, and that's where the integrated alarm part is coming in. And then, as I also mentioned, that you can, if you need to do any kind of custom type of automation work based on the matrices, for that you can create a Lambda function and do any kind of work you want to do. So that's for that. That would be your CloudWatch. So either your S3 bucket related performance, your Lambda function performances as well. If you need to troubleshoot, knowing that where is it breaking, what it's doing, things like that, those would be all available to you through CloudWatch. And then you already have what's called CloudTrail. So CloudTrail is your to check your account activities in a sense. So the CloudTrail is the collection of all the API calls that you're going to be doing. So I mean, বারবারই বলছিলাম যে AWS is just everything is an API. So when you're playing around with it, all the API calls that you're doing, those would be, you can create API logs, any kind of, from a security perspective, if there is any unusual activity, anything out of the blue. Same thing as we talked about before. So it uses CloudTrail is one example that I was giving, that if there is someone, if there is an user who's spinning up আপনার Bitcoin mining করার জন্য 48 core 192 gigabytes RAM এর কোন graphic GPU instance যদি কেউ spin up করে, that makes an API call, and if that happens, you can know about it immediately. So same thing, you can do actionable insights and also alarms based on those activities. So it's just you know about those activities immediately and something out of the blue. So that's very helpful from important from a security perspective as well. And not only know that something happened, you can also know, once again, since it's API, you can also know that who's doing it, what time, and all that information. So nothing goes unnoticed. So this is like CloudTrail and CloudWatch. These are very important resources for you to have that resource management and have a proper overview of who's doing what and how your resources are getting spent. And then from another managing resource, we also have what we call Cost Explorer. I didn't include that here, but this is something that would be setting up your budget and all other options from a cost perspective. But that also uses CloudWatch and CloudTrail as well. So this is just example of some of the requests that you can see from CloudWatch. So, what kind of requests it put, how many requests has been done, get requests, list requests, put requests, things like that. If there were any errors, what are some of the requests, like how many bytes were downloaded, uploaded, all of that information. This is a very small chunk of the API calls you can do, but there are a lot more. So এটা ছিল, and then this is a management console view of আপনার if you want to see. So this is more important on so this is for S3, but this comes more handy for your EC2 instance usage. If you want to see that how is it performing, it can create a near real-time graph. So it can do that. So the minimum can be, by default, can be 1 minute. And then by default, it's set to 5 minutes. You can put it to 1 minute for detail. And then you can also install agents on your EC2 instance to have more, if you want to have the matrices pushed in a smaller interval. So আপনার কাছে সেই অপশনটাও আছে আর কি. So this is the last slide that I have because I know we talked about a lot of stuff, but this one of the, since we're talking about best practices, I definitely want to mention well-architected framework and tool. So anything, basically everything we do in AWS, whether creating our own services or as a solutions architect, আমি যখন একটা কাস্টমারের সাথে কাজ করতে যাচ্ছি এবং what I'm trying to do when I'm designing a solution for them in general, we're following these 5 pillars. So well-architected framework, these are some of the concepts and rules that we follow, is just to make sure that your application is, as we mentioned, it's high performing, resilient, and efficient. So these are, operation excellence, security, making sure it's properly secured, reliability, and performance efficiency. So that is, making sure it's highly available and fault tolerant, your application. Highly available means, your application is available as much as possible and making sure that it meets your RPO and business RPO and RTO. And then also fault tolerant. Fault tolerant would be that if something starts breaking down, how much it's affecting your application. So that, and then also finally cost optimization, because one of the main part of having AWS is that you want to make sure that it's cost effective. So making sure that. And the thing with that is these are the things we follow, but we also actually sort of made that as a tool. So what we want to do that is not just for us to follow that, also for the customers to follow it. So with the well-architected framework tool, that's available to all the users, given that they have the access to it, is to go through it. And what it does is it goes through several list of questions for each of the pillars. So you go through it, talk about, and then answer those questions. Those are focused on operation excellence, security, reliability, performance, and cost. For each of them, there are several questions. You go answer all of that, and then what that does is, based on that answer, it tells you that what are some of the things that you're doing good, what are some of the things that needs to be improved. Basically, it's reviewing your entire workload, and you can do it yourself. it reviews the state of your workload, and then আপনাকে immediately একদম latest AWS and cloud industry যে best practice গুলো, based on that, how you are standing, how your infrastructure is standing, it gives you a review of that. And not only that, it will suggest you what you can do to change that, because what it does is, so you have your questions, you do the questions, and then it does a review. It gives you guidance. It tells you what are the things you can do for each of the steps. And then finally, what it does is you get a report. The report includes it has videos for all the videos, documentations, best practices, what's good, what's not, all of that. So you not only have just the review, but also what are the resources do you have to better that, how to improve that. And the best part of that is all of that is free. You're not paying for any of that. So you just use it, get a report. You're basically paying for any of the underlying, if it using any kind of resources, just paying for that. But the reporting and all of that, the tool, it doesn't cost you anything. So I would highly encourage that you guys play around with it. As I mentioned, that this is something, it's literally you go there, check some questions, answer some questions, things like that, and it's designed to do it yourself. Play around with it, it will tell you. There are some other ones, I haven't included all of that, but also a very helpful one is called Trusted Advisor. So Trusted Advisor, it works based on the well-architected framework as well. But what Trusted Advisor does is it also, if you give it permission, it will go through your architecture and then proactively suggest you things. So if it sees that, one example could be that one of your EC2 instance, there was a port open at some point. There was some changes made, the port is still open, no one uses it, it's just open. It will tell you, the Trusted Advisor will tell you there's a port open. And you will see if there's something very flawed, there's a very bright red লাল রঙের সেটাও আছে, plus also if it's something doing good, সবুজ রঙের, plus also something warning signs there. So there are different tiers of it, but it gives you proactive suggestions on what you can do to make things better, make your application more better based on these frameworks. So that's for the EC2. From S3's perspective, same thing. It does storage analysis for you, giving you suggestions. From EC2 also, what Trusted Advisor does is if it sees that you are using some EC2 instances on demand, regular basis, যেটা বললাম আর কি প্রথমে বলেছিলাম যে if it sees that you are using it on demand, but you could easily move that to a reserve instance and save money, that is an advice you can get from Trusted Advisor, and they will help you. And AWS is very resilient about helping our customers, and that's one of the reasons as we grow, we want to make sure that our customers are growing with us. So from a cost perspective, that's why we have all these tools to manage and make sure that you're not overpaying, to the point so AWS started in 2006, and since 2006 there has been 77 proactive price reduction হয়েছে. And that's just whenever AWS was able to make things better and reduce the cost, they just distributed that to the customers. And also the tidbit of that is so far since 2006 AWS এর কোনো সার্ভিসের প্রাইস এখন পর্যন্ত একবারও বাড়ে নাই, so just 77 বার দাম কমেছে আর কি. So these are some of the tools that you can utilize to make sure that you have some savings as well. Trusted Advisor, it's very new, so these are services that uses machine learning in the background to work. But yeah, so that's pretty much all I have. I know we've gone for a very long time. So any questions right now? I would love to know.
Thank you, Tariq. It was like super session. Thank you for your time. এবং আমার মনে হয় এই আমাদের অনেকগুলা কোয়েশ্চেন অ্যান্সার অলরেডি সেশনগুলোতে কভার হয়ে গেছে, এন্ড থ্যাংক ইউ ফর অল যারা কষ্ট করে টাইমটা দিছে। সো ডেফিনেটলি থ্যাংক ইউ ভেরি মাচ। এনি কোয়েশ্চেন, আমরা হয়তো আর বেশিক্ষণ সময় নাই, উই ক্যান টেক লাইক 10 minutes মোর, এন্ড আমরা কোয়েশ্চেনগুলো নিতে পারি কারণ কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন থাকে।
ওকে,
এনি কোয়েশ্চেন? আসিফ, শারিয়া? হাই। আচ্ছা, আমাদের কয়েকটা কোয়েশ্চেন ছিল চ্যাটে। আরেফিন আরেফিন কি আছে? হ্যাঁ, রিগার্ডিং অটোমেশনস, হোয়াট ইজ
হ্যাঁ ভাইয়া আছি, কেমন আছেন?
অটোমেশন? ভালো, কি অবস্থা? ভালো, কি অবস্থা? ভালো,
হ্যাঁ
perfect. আচ্ছা, আরেফিনের কোয়েশ্চেন ছিল রিগার্ডিং অটোমেশন, হোয়াট ইজ দিস? আরেফিনের কোয়েশ্চেন ছিল রিগার্ডিং অটোমেশন, হোয়াট ইজ দিস ক্লাউড ফরমেশন অর টেরাফর্ম?
নাশিদ ভাই একো হচ্ছে, I missed the question.
আচ্ছা, এটা ছিল হচ্ছে আরেফিন, কি আস দ্য কোয়েশ্চেন তাহলে আমরা
অ্যাকচুয়ালি মাই কোশ্চেন ইজ, শুনতে পাচ্ছেন?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ শুনতে পাচ্ছি।
আচ্ছা, আমার একটা প্রজেক্ট ছিল লাইক নেক্সট মান্থ, মানে আফটার দিস পিরিয়ড হবে সামথিং বিল্ড টু ইসি টু ভিপিসি থেকে একটা ফুল আর্কিটেকচার লাইক ফর অ্যাপ্লিকেশন জন্য একটা সার্ভার ডিপ্লয়মেন্ট হবে, লাইক থাউজেন্ড অফ, আই মিন মোর দেন 100 অফ সার্ভার। সো they are asking like that, which one is good, Terraform or CloudFormation?
আপনারা কি মানে মেইনলি এন্টায়ারলি AWS?
কিছু ক্লায়েন্ট Azure, কিছু ক্লায়েন্ট আছে AWS এর, বাট মোস্টলি আমরা AWS প্রেফার করতেছি।
আচ্ছা, আমি বলবো যে যদি আপনার মোস্টলি AWS থাকে, Terraform AWS does support Terraform, but it's definitely it's easier to have CloudFormation, because the main reason for that is just the ease. The ease of
মনে হয় আরেফিন তুমি তুমি একটু মিট করে ফেলো, মনে হয় আরেফিন তুমি একটু মিট করে ফেলো, so I guess the info will be
okay yeah
back to you. So I guess
আচ্ছা হ্যাঁ সরি, সো যা বলছিলাম যে টেরাফর্মের থেকে, টেরাফর্ম ইজ সামথিং you can use, এটা যেটা বললাম যে AWS definitely support করে, but one of the biggest easier, কারণ Terraform actually AWS এর one of the APN or partner network এর সদস্য তারা আর কি। সো পার্টনার হচ্ছে যে ডিফারেন্ট থার্ড পার্টি যারা আর কি AWS সাথে ডিরেক্টলি কাজ করে। So Terraform is definitely up there. So what partners does is they get vetted, they go through some process and all of that, and then particularly AWS service দেওয়ার জন্য তারা থাকে। So you can use it, definitely, but আমি personally যদি mainly AWS shop হয়, আমি বলবো CloudFormation use করা। Two reasons. First of all হচ্ছে যে it doesn't cost you anything. So CloudFormation এর coding তৈরি করতে you don't need any kind of anything else, since it's only JSON and YAML. You just code it in a notepad and just be done with it. You're not paying for anything extra. When you're running the template, the only thing you're paying for it is the infrastructure will spin up based on that template. That's it. There's no other cost. And also the second thing is the ease of integration, because since it's an AWS service, so any AWS service that you want to integrate with it, just makes it that easier to spin it up, do the work, and then when you want to give it a permission, all of that just makes it that easier, and also cheaper as well. যেটা বললাম যে so in CloudFormation, one of the things CloudFormation does, it's I should have done it in an asterisk, that the free version that I was talking about, it is free for all of the AWS resources that you spin up. You can use CloudFormation to actually spin up outside third-party applications as well, but that has a cost associated with it. It's pretty nominal, but there is a cost associated with that. So from that perspective, you're saving money from there as well. So আমার সাজেশন হবে হচ্ছে for that is particular যদি কোনো Terraformer feature that you want to use, সেটা যদি AWS available না থাকে, in that case by all means use that, because as I mentioned that they're partners, so you can still use it, but if it's the same features, then CloudFormation would be a better option.
Okay.
সালে ভাই, হ্যাঁ আপনার কোথায় কোশ্চেন ছিল একটা?
জি, কোশ্চেনটা হচ্ছে যে আহ, ভাইয়া বলতেছিলেন যে অ্যাপ্লিকেশনটা বেটার পারফর্ম করার জন্য এডব্লিউএস এ হোস্ট করার একটা কারণ হচ্ছে যে আহ, আমি যাতে অটো স্কেলিং এর ফ্যাসিলিটিসটা নিতে পারি। আমার যখন স্পাইক আসবে আমি কাস্টমারকে কোনো রকম ইয়ে না দিয়ে আমি যাতে সার্ভ করতে পারি। বাট যেটা আমরা ফেস করছি আর কি, যে অ্যাপ্লিকেশন গুলো এখন আহ, অধিকাংশই লেখা হচ্ছে স্ট্যান্ড অ্যালোন সার্ভারের জন্য। অ্যাপ্লিকেশনে ক্যাশ সেশনস এভরিথিং ম্যানেজড ইন সিঙ্গেল থিং, মানে লাইক আমাদের অ্যাপ্লিকেশনটা মেমোরিতে ক্যাশ এন্ড সেশন ম্যানেজ হয়। তো আমরা সেভারাল টাইমস ট্রাই করেছি আমাদের অ্যাপ্লিকেশনটা অটো স্কেলিং এ মুভ করার জন্য। আমরা 2017 সালে এডব্লিউএস এ মুভ করেছি, স্টিল আমরা মানে পারিনি এখনো, বিকজ হচ্ছে যে সেশন এন্ড ক্যাশ একটা বিষয়, যেটা আমরা ট্রাই করেছি রেডিস থেকে সার্ভ করার জন্য। বাট রেডিসে আমাদের অভিজ্ঞতা হচ্ছে যে আমরা যখন রেডিসে মুভ করি, Redis can't really serve us with the speed we need. So there are many areas that we face problem with. So what are the other points that we need to handle to really serve the application in auto scaling mode?
So one of the things I would definitely suggest in ব্যাপারে is to the thing I was talking about is like making the infrastructure more loosely coupled, is that particular actioner যে পার্ট গুলো অ্যাপ্লিকেশনের ওগুলোকে ছোট ছোট মাইক্রো সার্ভিস করে ফেলা। আপনার রেডিসের if it's unable to handle, why is it unable? Because Redis Elasticache যেটা একটা AWS service, সেটা কিন্তু that's actually utilizing, you can do either memcached or Redis. So that could be your, for your queuing, that could be one of your option, is to have that from one part to another. So if you're doing some kind of session management, I can understand that that's, I guess, happening between your web server and then your app, or web part and the application part. So there is a caching that's happening in between. So you can break that apart. And because what that does is same thing, that it just helps you to understand and knowing like when to upscale. So because right now the problem you're facing, even in order for auto scaling, সেটা হচ্ছে যে it needs to auto scale, but if when it's triggering, it really doesn't know যে কেন triggerটা হচ্ছে. Is it something failing on the web server side? Is it something failing on, if the Redis is also hosted in that EC2 server as well? Is it because of that, or if there is anything else happening on the application side? So ওই যে segregation গুলো এবং isolation গুলো ওগুলোর জন্যই আর কি প্রয়োজন এখন। সো ওই মানে আপনার ওই ট্রাবল শুটিং গুলো আগে করা প্রয়োজন, তাহলে বুঝতে পারবেন যে আপনার এক্স্যাক্টলি কোন জায়গাটা প্রবলেমটা হচ্ছে বেশি আর কি। And usually auto scaling এ আপনার যেটা when you run an EC2 instance, usually takes about 1 or 2 minutes for something in general, unless it's like a really special EC2 instance. So, and it's very unlikely যে one of the উদাহরণ যেটা আমরা কথা বললাম যে from 30% utilization it's spiking to completely 100%. That is not normal. So ওখানে আমাদের আর কি অন্য ব্যাপারগুলো দেখতে হবে যে if the EC2 instance is it actually the right size? So is it too big or is it too small? Because from 30% CPU utilization to 100%, that's a very big jump, to the point it's breaking the entire application. So we need to see what's happening in between that's causing it. Is it only the spike of users coming in, or is there something else happening? So ওই জিনিসগুলো দেখার জন্য, ওই ট্রাবল শুটিং করার জন্য মানে ইজিলি করার জন্য আর কি মেইনলি বলা হয় যে to loosely coupling all of that. I don't know if I'm helping, but that
Okay,
will be.
I got a supplementary question here. Like we tried with Redis, but the output was like Redis really didn't serve that fast that we need. Like without Redis, for placing order, like as we are in e-commerce business, customers place order in our system. So for placing order, a order with one item takes 1 minute with Redis. For an order with 10 items takes 10 minutes with Redis. Whereas without Redis, I mean using the memory of the instances, it takes less than 30 seconds. So what we came to understand that Redis won't work for us. So the question is, can sessions and cache be managed using DynamoDB, the AWS DynamoDB?
Yeah, you can. I mean, if it's a completely linear, then one of the things I can see, and I'm honestly, full disclosure, I'm not a Redis expert, but one of the things I can see, যদি 1 minute থেকে 10 minute, so that means there is no parallel processing happening. So ওই জিনিসটা দেখতে হবে যেখানে parallel threading টা on কিনা, because when you're using instance memory, যেটা বললেন, যে that's by default it's capable of doing parallel processing. But সেটা যদি threaded না থাকে Redis এ, is that a feature that we can turn on, or that's not that? But that being said, so that's one of those things, something to think about. But to answer your second part of the question, yes, DynamoDB is definitely capable of doing that as well.
Well, for Redis, we tried with different size of Redis instances, Redis nodes, but nothing really worked for us.
Acha. I'll try to see if I can find anything. Then Nashid Bhai, I'll try to forward something. If I find anything, yeah. So what are some of the ways to sort of do the processing parallelly? Because it seems like that would be something we can look into.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Question so we can clear it out. যদি কোনো কারো question থাকে, if you have any questions, তাহলে আমরা হয়তো our 5 minutes we can take that questions. We're already we had a good session, definitely, and আমরা আরেকটা যেটা হচ্ছে যে আমরা next sessionটা আমরা will try to find out the time তারিখের, and then হয়তো আমরা সিকিউরিটির উপরে বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস নিয়ে কথা বলতে পারি। বাট আপনাদের যদি কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন থাকে, এখন যদি মনে না থাকে or আপনারা রাইট করে রাখছেন, ফিল ফ্রি টু, আমি একটা ইমেল করেছি info@cloudcreative.tech, সো ওখানে আমাকে পাঠিয়ে দিতে পারেন, or feel free to reach out because you have my number, তাহলে আমি সেটা তারিখে পাঠিয়ে দিব, and I'll try to find out the answers definitely. So any questions, or না হলে আমরা হয়তো we can close the meeting, the webinar. Okay, আমার মনে হয় কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন নাই। Thank you, Tariq, and it's a pleasure to have you. আমরা অনেকদিন we were discussing যে কিভাবে কি করা যায়, but finally we got some time, and thanks for the lockdown as well. যে আমরা কিছু টাইমটাও পেলাম, and we utilize the best time সবার সাথে। আর thank you all. Asif from New Zealand, কেউ আসছে কানাডা থেকে, কেউ Arifin from Canada, আর বাংলাদেশি যারা কাস্টমার্স and যারা already working with AWS and everything. So thanks a lot. And আমরা definitely will set a time for the next session. Tariq, thank you very much for a very elaborate session, and আমরা আসলে definitely আমরা অনেক কিছু শিখলাম, and এই বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস গুলো ইমপ্লিমেন্ট করাটাই ব্যাপার। আর thanks a lot. আমার মনে হয় that we can conclude our webinar. Tariq, যদি তোমার কোনো ক্লোজিং নোট থাকে, please feel free to reach.
Not really. I mean, I hope you guys got some value out of it. So yeah, I mean, any kind of feedback I would love to know. So Nashid Bhai, let him know. And then, if there's any other resources you guys need, I'll try to post my LinkedIn or something. So
definitely.
Yeah.
আর কারো যদি কোনো সাজেশন থাকে যে লাইক নেক্সট টপিক আমরা হয়তো বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস অন করতে চাই হচ্ছে সিকিউরিটি নিয়ে, বিকজ দিস ইজ ওয়ান অফ দি এরিয়া, ইটস আ ব্রড এরিয়া। তারপরেও যদি কারো কোনো সাজেশন থাকে যে you guys want the next session will be like this topic, feel free to reach out to me, তাহলে আমরা সেভাবে সেট করব। So thanks a lot. আর আমার মনে হয় সেশনটা হেল্পফুল হবে, and definitely we'll see you somewhere very soon in the lockdown timer mode, inshallah. Right. Yeah, thank you, Tariq, and all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.